I'm Peter Cherukuri, CEO and founder of upNEXT, and I'm not Steve Clements. But let's give a round of applause to Steve. What a marathon that he's done. As Steve mentioned, I'm the CEO of upNEXT. We're a social platform for what we call industrial patriots. And I think everyone in this room can consider themselves an industrial patriot because we all care about three things. We care about the companies we work for, we care about our careers, but we also care about our country. And I'm really excited to our next conversation is someone who is truly a patriot, an industrial patriot, an economist, one of the great thinkers that we have in our society, and that's Stephen Moore. Stephen? Great, thank you. Have a seat. Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time. You've had such a great career that has been, for lack of a better word, of course, focused on growth and growth of our country, and as played an instrumental role in the Trump administration, in the first Trump administration on economic policy. You recently left Heritage Foundation. You were the founder of Club for Growth, and now you're with Unleash Prosperity. For this audience and for me, I'd love to hear from your perspective, how do you define prosperity?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, Peter, thanks for having me, and good to see everyone. Look, I think growth is the solution to almost every problem that we have. I know you had earlier today some people talking about the budget deficit and our debt. The way to deal with that is to grow the economy, outgrow the debt, and we have the capability of doing that. If you look at the wealth of this country, when I first came to Washington in 1982, you want to take a wild guess at what the Dow Jones Industrial Average was?
What was it? I can't do it.
Anybody know?
Quiz.
1,000.
Anybody? 1,000.
1,000.
Oh, now, wow.
Today we're at Dow 47,000. We have lived through the greatest period of wealth creation in the history of civilization in the last 3 or 4 decades. And this can continue. I'm super bullish on the U.S. economy, and I think the most important thing is that we make sure that we have a shared prosperity, that it benefits every group. That's something, when I've talked to Donald Trump, he is so engaged in how do we get lower income and upper income people to climb up the economic ladder. So it's growth, but it's in a way that benefits all income groups.
So prosperity is growth, but also there's a concern around some macro trends that you and I were talking about this earlier that I think would be great for our C-SPAN viewers, for you to kind of alert them, then how that kind of this concern about population is also tied to how we can close some of that concerns of growth for all.
That's right. Look, I believe we're going to, by the way, I'm super bullish on the U.S. economy right now, really bullish. I think 2026, we're going to see potentially 4 to 4.5% growth, which is enormous. The tax cut is teed up. You see the profitability of American companies is just something to marvel over. We do have some restraints on growth, though, and one of them is people. Our greatest asset, obviously, is our people, and you and I were talking off stage about the fact that one of the things that worries me the most, and this is, since most of you are investors here, it's the single thing you should be most worried about, and that is what I call a catastrophically low birth rate around the world. Almost every developed country is facing a declining population. You have some countries that have birth rates in Europe and in Asia that are like 1.5 kids per couple. Let me put it very simply, a country cannot grow if its population is not growing. And so we're below replacement level fertility in the United States today. We have to find ways to either bring birth rates up. And by the way, if you're looking at some of these most recent statistics, they're not very encouraging. Women and men are getting married at later dates, and they're having fewer kids. And one of the things that I feel is really critical for the U.S., I mean, it's happening in virtually every developed country in the world. And by the way, the irony here is, how many of you are old enough to remember the population bomb? Remember that when, 40 years ago they talked about, oh my God, Paul Ehrlich wrote this best-selling book about the population. There's not a population bomb today. There's a population implosion. And so one of the huge advantages, the reason you want to invest in the United States, one of our biggest advantages is that we have immigration. And we are the one country in the world that can import young people to this country. And there's, we can get the best, the most talented, the most hardworking people. And so we need to make sure they got to come legally. We have to have a legal system that brings them in legally. But that's a huge advantage in the United States, is one reason I feel like we're going to continue to lead the world.
So the work that you're doing at Unleash Prosperity, tell me how this piece around concern of this macro trend around population, a lack of population growth, but the opportunity that is a core competitive advantage for the United States of still being a destination against a backdrop that, as we were talking, that there are some concerns about administration's views on immigration and some of the raids. And so how do you want to navigate and help the administration and for our audience here think through some of these interlocking systems that are at play?
Well, there's what one of my buddies is Arthur Laffer, one of probably the most influential economists in the world, and he and I always talk about the pillars to prosperity. What do you need from a country to make it prosperous? Well, first of all, you need free trade. Free trade is the essence of what. If it weren't for trade, we'd all be living in caves. And so obviously trade is critical. Second of all, you need a currency that is strong and stable. And we are hugely advantaged, obviously. I say, this is something David Malpass has taught me, but we want to defend the dollar, right, David? And we want to make sure that the dollar remains the world reserve currency. We want to have a tax system that has a low rate but a broad base, so everybody's paying their fair share. And we want minimal government intrusion into the economy. If you do those four things, you'll have a prosperous economy. And look, Trump has his faults. I talk to him all the time. But one good thing is he's oriented on how do we make America number one and continue to be number one, which is what a president should do.
So these pillars, this playbook, I love it. There's kind of 4 pillars of prosperity. When you talk about sort of government involvement, you recently, I think it was just yesterday, and you wrote a great piece in the Wall Street Journal that was talking about this that President Trump has said in 2026 we're going to get $2,000. That comes back from tariff rebates. And I know there's kind of a question about that term. But you've taken a kind of a nuanced, contrarian approach to this idea, and you wrote about it. You want to unpack that for this audience?
Well, basically, Trump had made this point that we have about $300 billion of tariff revenue each year. And by the way, look, I think Trump has done I don't like tariffs, but I do like trade deals, and I think he's actually accomplished some very good trade deals that give America, a level playing field. Trump is, I don't always agree with Trump, but I think on balance, when he talked about this idea of giving back some of this money to the people, because ultimately Americans pay the cost of the tariff. What we said was, okay, if you're going to do that, don't just give people money. There's nothing worse than just giving people handouts, and that is a bad idea. And so the rebate idea of just giving people $2,000, that actually is going to make inflation worse, and it's going to discourage people from working rather than encourage it. So what we said is, why don't you, instead of giving money to people who aren't working, why don't you give money to people who are working? And one of the good ways of doing that would be to lower the payroll tax. So right now, every worker from the first dollar they earn pays a 15.3% payroll tax. That's a discouragement on working. It's a discouragement on hiring. So how do you encourage more hiring and more work? Well, you lower the payroll tax and use that as an incentive mechanism to get more work, money into the hands of people who need it, and also encouraging businesses to hire more people.
It's a bold idea, but what things have to be true in order for this to happen?
Well, there was you may have seen I think this morning, Trump announced that he wants another, what we call a reconciliation bill, which would be another tax bill. And that would be a good thing. We should do that. And I think it should include this idea of a payroll tax cut. The other idea that I've been, urging the president to think about is, what's the big issue that everybody in America is talking about right now? The housing affordability crisis. And one way you could deal with that is to exempt the sale of a primary residence from the capital gains tax, or else do that, or else index the gain for inflation. I think about people like my parents. They bought a house 40 years ago for $100,000. Now it's worth $1.2 million. But at least half that gain is just due to inflation. So we should either index or give people just a zero tax on capital gains. If you did that on primary residences, older people, who are baby boomers would sell their home, and you'd free up a huge amount of housing. But people are locked into their homes right now. They cannot sell their homes because the capital gains tax they pay would be so high. So that would be a great way to get a bigger addition of a supply into the housing market, because we need more homes.
So what we've talked about here is kind of almost a microeconomic policy to a macro introduction of kind of the tariffs, instead of kind of helping those people who are actually in the workforce, giving them some relief. You're also talking here about those people that actually own a home. There's another side to this that you also recently wrote that are, even for those people who aren't in the workforce yet, that is not just about economic prosperity, but you have some interesting thoughts about cultural prosperity and things that need to happen around at the college level. And to address this, I'm sure everyone is feeling right now that perhaps the number one issue in our next election is about affordability. Yeah. So how are you thinking about affordability? Some of the trends that we see young people saying that they can't achieve the American dream. How are you thinking through that, and what policies needed to come in?
Well, you're right. The buzzword of the last 6 months has been affordability. And let me just start by saying that there is no time and no place in the history of the world where people have more affordability than they do today. I mean, it's just a fact. I mean, if you look at the last 10 months, we just ran the numbers. The average family, adjusted for inflation, has $1,200 more than they did at the start of the year. And so affordability is kind of a relative term, but there's no other time in the history of the planet you'd want to be alive, and no place you'd want to be than here right now. Now, this is every young generation. By the way, the affordability issue is a big issue for people in their 20s and 30s, right? I have two sons that are in their early 30s. They can't afford, and they have decent jobs. They can't afford to buy a house. I mean, the housing stock has become so expensive. But I think we just need to put it in perspective. Now, the other thing that worries me related to this is what we're seeing now. I was just looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers on this. If you look at males between the ages of 16 and 35, over the last 30 years, there have been a very, very troubling decline in the number of them working. And that's a really bad problem for a lot of reasons. One is we need young males to be working. By the way, women are more likely to be in the labor force, and men less likely than they were before.
What's your theory about this? There must be.
It's a good question why that's happening. Well, obviously, there's just more opportunities for women, so and there's been a cultural shift, clearly, and that's a good thing. So I'm really mostly focused on why young men are not working. And it's a good question. I mean, I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe the kind of jobs that they want aren't available. One of the pieces of advice for parents in this room and parents watching on C-SPAN, one of the single most important thing that presages success in your life, start working at a very young age. The younger someone starts working, the more likely they are to be successful in their life. So this is why things like the minimum wage are terrible ideas. Because what does the minimum wage do? It prices young people out of the labor force, when in fact we want young people to be working and learning job skills and things of that nature. So that's a big problem. And we've got to encourage young males to start working at 15 or 16 years old. You just learn. Do you remember the first job you ever had?
Absolutely.
I bet most of you in this room, everybody remembers their first job. I was working at a little warehouse outside of Chicago where I grew up. I was working there 20 hours a week when I was in high school. And you know what the most important lesson I learned from that was? I don't want to spend the rest of my life working in a warehouse, right? But no, look, you learn basic job skills. Show up on time. You better be nice to your boss. You better be productive. All of these things. And the earlier you learn those things, the better. You know, when I worked at you didn't mention the fact that one of my favorite jobs I've had was I worked for 10 years at the Wall Street Journal, you know, which is the most important publication in the world. And the cool thing about that was every week we'd have amazing people, CEOs, people who were stars, athletes, people who were, you know, at the top of their profession, finance, business, whatever it was. And it was so interesting. One of the first questions I'd always ask these incredibly successful people is, you know, where'd you grow up? And it was stunning to me how many of these people grew up on a farm, on a farm. Now, why is that interesting? Because I don't know if anybody in this room grew up on a farm, but if you grew up on a farm like my wife did, you start working when you're about 10 years old, right? And so we need a stronger work ethic in this country.
Of course, this can come across if I'm looking at our audience, I'm not going to age them, but if we had sort of that Gen Z 20-something audience here, like, oh, boomer, you're just talking down at me. That's not what we're talking about. There's some timeless things that are important, hard work, and it's happening.
Pretty simple.
But bring those things back to some of the other things that have been talked about today against a backdrop of just uncertainty that are tied to technological revolutions. Yep. Is AI going to take my job?
Yes.
And this consternation on both the pocketbook as well as where do I work right now? Do I have a job? And what's the value of even going to college? How are you thinking through that reality that this next generation is facing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And by the way, I know you've had discussions about AI throughout this meeting, and I've listened to many, you know, really interesting insights. My own view with this is Americans have no idea how fast this is coming. It is going to come in like a hurricane, and it is going to change everything, the way we work, the way we play, the way we study. Every aspect of life is going to change radically in the next 10 years. And I don't think Americans are quite ready for it. Now, this is also going to be the biggest productivity enhancing boom we ever saw. And if you look at economic growth, which we started this discussion on, what is economic growth, right, David? It's more people working and more people working more productively. And so we're going to see gigantic gains in productivity. You know, it's the biggest thing that ever happened since the tractor. You know, and by the way, if you go back 125 years ago, 30 out of every 100 Americans worked in agriculture. They were picking the fruits and working on the farm. Today, 2 out of 100 were. So we've been through these transitions before. We saw this transition with the internet. But it's going to be, like, I'll just give you one example. I joined the board of a company called Lightspeed recently. Anybody have heard of Lightspeed? It's a new company. We build houses with robots, and that's going to, by the way, you talk about a housing affordability problem. When you cut the cost of building a house by 40 to 50%, which we'll do with these robots, it means you're going to have a lot more housing stock because you can build them faster and cheaper. But what about the people who build houses? What about the construction workers? What's going to happen to them? There are about 3 million truck drivers in this country. 15 years ago, there will be 0 truck drivers. You know, everything will be transported in automated ways. So this is something we all better figure out. What's going to happen with these people when their jobs are displaced by technology? I don't have any good answers for that, but it is coming.
Well, we have a room full of people who, as I told you and to the audience, I refer to this kind of topics, industrial patriotism.
Yes.
And part of that is to
think
about, oh, great. Do you consider yourself an industrial patriot?
I think what we need in this country is more patriotism. We have the greatest country on the planet, and too many people dwell on our shortcomings, not on our greatness.
And adding the industrial piece is to think about in this room that we have both policymakers, we have people who work at some of these major companies, but that as you're talking to them, what do companies, let's start with the industry, need to be doing right now to be thinking about this reality of these macroeconomic trends, macrocultural trends, to meet this moment of trying to both skill up either show up to this next generation about these jobs? Is there something that industry needs to be doing more of that you'd like them to know?
Yeah, look, we better get, if you looked at some failings in our society right now, I think everybody would agree we have a huge failing in our school system. Our schools are just not performing. And when you see the test scores, when I saw the president about 6 months ago, I told him I think you should call a national education emergency, because especially for low-income people in inner cities, you've got just so many of the schools that are failing. How are those people ever going to have a chance? Those kids who are going to schools that can't teach them how to read, how to do math, all of these things. And so that leaves it to the businesses to be able to train these kids that haven't gotten a very good education. So if you were to ask me what the #1 priority for the country should be, it should be, we've got to do something about it. Every child in America should have a choice of any school they want to go to. This idea that the government tells you what school you go to, that's just an old-fashioned model. And the good news is we are seeing a big expansion in school choice and throughout the states, and that's a good first step. But businesses are going to have a hard time finding the workers if they can't do math, if they can't read, if they're not functional people. So let's make that a national commitment.
So one of the things that we've talked about, I think, kind of two extremes here in terms of what needs to be done with we need to increase the supply of people that go into the workforce. We need the people who are in the workforce, how do we get them some relief? Mm-hmm. Help me understand how you're thinking about what this administration is trying to do right now to stimulate some of those moves as we think about some of the critical bets, the bets that we're making on critical minerals, how we're thinking about industries where we're competing with China. How are you thinking about that in relationship to some of the topics we've been thinking through today?
Look, the big issue for the next 50 years on a macro level is, what country 50 years from now will be the world economic superpower. For the last 150 years, the United States has basically been the unrivaled superpower. Now we have a country, China, who's trying to knock us off our perch. I always say that's not going to happen because our Chinese are more, smarter than their Chinese. But look, we have to stay ahead of China, not just for economic reasons, for national security reasons as well. I mean, I view China as, as basically like, Japan circa 1937. They're a dangerous country building up their military in a very aggressive way. And the way to beat them, the way to beat Japan is the exact way. How did we beat the Soviet Union? How did Reagan beat the Soviet Union? We outgrew them. We grew so much faster than they did. So it was kind of an economic dynamism, and we need that here in the United States. By the way, I want to mention one statistic because, as I look at folks in the audience and talking to you, you're of Indian descent.
I am.
Your parents came from India?
They did.
You were born here.
I was born in Brooklyn, New York.
So just some really interesting statistics that I've been looking at that tell you a lot about what's happening in America. So today in the United States, do you know what the wealthiest ethnic group is?
What?
Asians, by far. By far. Asians now, the average family income of an Asian family in the United States is $115,000 a year, which is a lot, I mean, in historical terms. Asians have a higher income than whites do. I don't know how many, I was kind of shocked to see that. Asians have a 30% higher average income than whites do. By the way, which brings up the question, how can we be a racist country if people with brown skin have higher incomes? The other group that's doing fantastically in the United States today is Hispanics. We have seen a huge gain. The average Hispanic family today has an income of $72,000. And these are Hispanics who've only probably been here for 10, 15, 20 years. They're coming from desperately poor countries, and they're rising the economic ladder. The one group where we're not seeing big gains is in Black Americans. And we have to figure that out. Why is it we're not seeing those same gains that we're seeing for blacks, for Asians, for Hispanics and other groups? That should also be a key priority for us. How do we help? Hispanics now make more money than blacks do in the United States. It's kind of unbelievable because Hispanics have been in the country less. So there are a lot of challenges, but I'm very optimistic we can rise to the occasion.
Well, I'll give you the last question. So one final thought for if you're speaking to President Trump right now about all these themes, what's that one message you want him and his team to hear right now?
Make sure that the policies you're putting forward obviously are putting America first, which he will do, but concentrate on how these policies will lift everyone. You know, my favorite saying in economics comes from John F. Kennedy: a rising tide lifts all boats. And we have to make sure that this rising tide that we're looking at over the next 10 years is not just going to help rich people, but middle class people, low income people, so everyone prospers.
Stephen, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.